Thank you so much for being here. Our two very special speakers don't really need any introduction. Ruchira Gupta, a professor at NYU, Emmy-winning journalist, founder of Apnea App. Through that organization, you've literally helped thousands of women and girls escape prostitution, and the author of I Kick and I Fly, which is available for free on the table outside, so please pick one up. Ashley Judd, also, you need no introduction. We know you from so many great movies, but we also know you for your humanitarian work, your focus on gender justice. You were actually here in 2016, and we are so honored to have you back again and to hear you. We are dedicated here at Proskauer to help victims of trafficking, to advocate for changes in various policies. Keep in mind that in New York State, it's more common for a victim of trafficking to be arrested for prostitution than it is for a trafficker or someone who purchases sex to be prosecuted. So we have a long way to go, but it's really wonderful to have these two remarkable people here with us today. I'll turn it over to you, Ruchira.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Proskauer and Rose, for hosting this wonderful lunch for Ashley and I. We are in a room full of people who are well-wishers, who have come all the way from as far away as Connecticut to listen to our fireside chat on human trafficking and my new book, I Kick and I Fly. So a big thank you to all of you for making the time on a busy New York day, as I know. And to Ashley, who is a friend. She's a fellow activist and a fellow Gandhian, can I say?
Yes, you can.
Who has a deep love for India, and she comes again and again to work with my NGO Apnea App, volunteer, and do things from the grassroots for the change that we imagine will happen at the top, a world in which no child and no human being is bought or sold. So thank you, Ashley.
Of course.
And thank you to all the activists in the room who are doing the same thing. Rachel from World Without Exploitation. I can see some survivors who are here, survivor leaders. Thank you all for being here. Today, we are going to make this conversation very easy and casual. It's a fireside chat. It's not a moderated conversation. I'll begin just by sharing the story of my book. I Kick and I Fly is about a young girl who escapes prostitution by becoming a Kung Fu champion. She's from a nomadic tribe in India, and she's dirt poor. There's no food at home. She's expelled from school for beating up a class bully who teases her for coming from the red light area, being too hungry to focus on class. And she knows her days are numbered because her father wants to sell her into prostitution when the cattle fair comes to town. But a women's rights advocate enrolls her into a Kung Fu program. This women's rights advocate runs a hostel. Now, this women's rights advocate could not have also done it alone, except without the resolve of that girl's mother, who stands up to her alcoholic father. And I began writing this book, I Kick and I Fly, when a girl just like the girl in my book, Hira, her name is Hira, which means diamond, won a gold medal in my NGO, Apnea App, in a very small town called Forbisganj in Bihar. And I was so full of pride and joy when she won the gold medal. My heart was full and I wanted to share it with the world. So I knew what she had overcome, and I got onto a flight and began writing the novel. And then when the plane landed, there were so many things which sort of took over my time. I stopped writing the novel. And then during the lockdown, I began to read stories of how recruiters were working online and using the fact that kids were not in school, their loneliness and the isolation, to recruit people, not just the girls from nomadic tribes, but in all homes across the world, including in the United States, taking advantage of their loneliness. Some of them were facing food insecurity at that time, homelessness. They were also facing online bullying, body shaming. And I thought, I need to share this story with kids because they need to know that you can stand up to injustice and win. And so I finished the story then because it's a story about hope. It's a story about courage. It's a story about women's collective action. And, no one who has been more a part of that collective action than Ashley, who is sitting here with me today. So Ashley, my first question to you is that, what made you become the person you are who wanted to actually get into the red light areas in Kolkata, which are so dangerous, dirty, smelly, and difficult? Even from the point of view of trauma, like looking at people and what they're going through, and same thing in the villages of Bihar for Bisganj. I know that it was hard, and yet you kept coming every year to do service. Where does that impulse come from?
Such a good question. Thank you, Ruchi. And just a quick greeting to everyone. There are so many demands on our time and so many diverse and interesting things with which we could be doing a lunch, and it's a real testimony to where your hearts and your spirits are that you would choose to be with us in The Last Girl. So thank you for that. And thanks, Bill, for hosting us again. The simple answer is that, and now I'm going to cry, I love it. And I love her. I love that girl, that woman, the one with whom I sit, the one whose hand I hold, the one who is evasive and shut down and so traumatized that she can't speak. And it is fundamentally about acknowledging that while the details may differ, our stories really are the same. And I have such a profound identification with the girls and women who are sitting in brothels because a man molested me for the first time that I remember when I was 7 years old. And that was in Eastern Kentucky. And I was looking for a quarter to play pinball, for those of you who remember the old pinball machines, in Mama Mia's Pizzeria in Berea, Kentucky. And he said, come sit on my lap, and did what he did. And I immediately went and told 2 adults, and they said, oh, he's a nice old man. That's not what he meant. And that was the beginning of my recollected, because I also know that I had sexual trauma in junior high school, of which I have no memory, but for which there is a police record. And that, as I mean, was the beginning of my walk with male sexual violence. And then I was sent to Japan to model as a teenager, which was really a summer of commercial sexual exploitation. The first day I showed up in the modeling agency, I was instructed to take off all my clothes and walk around in front of all the adults so they could evaluate my body. And this was day 1. And they sent me out on auditions, and men did what men did. And I was molested by the head of the agency. I was raped a couple of times. I was assaulted by various people. I lived alone in an apartment. 2 sovereign nations organized the unescorted work visa for a minor. And so I saw the complicitness of the state. I saw the force of capitalist markets. I saw the male gaze. I saw commercial advertising. I mean, I saw all these forces that work to subjugate and commodify girls and women to male entitlement to female bodies. And that's what's happening in these brothels. And so, as I said, the details may differ, but the story and the fundamental exploitation is, to me, viscerally identical. And, my story began with Population Services International, which is a tremendous public health NGO that works often in brothels, helping girls and women negotiate safer sex. It's triage. It's not abolition. It's just triage. And that's how I ended up in the brothels in the first place. And then I said, if I'm going to be here, I have to do abolition, and I have to expand the aperture and scope of my work. And when I went to India one time, I was speaking with Gloria Steinem, because she's all about connectivity and introducing people. And if you say something to ask Gloria a question, her answer is uniformly yes. I said, who else do I need to know in India? And she said, you have to know Ruchira Gupta. And that's how Ruchira and I met. And the first night, which is a story we don't have time to tell, she and I basically usurped a big fancy party and staged a protest on the stage, hijacked it, and got really rowdy. And I was going to lay my body down and not leave India until this young woman was released from a home. And anyway, we just did what we do. And
we won.
And we won. And we won. Um, and, you know, they do smell. They are very dirty. The water service, if there is any, is maybe 2 hours a day. And, you know, women are exploited for sex on beds where their children are playing underneath the beds. And if there's a roof, the children will go upstairs and try to play on the roofs to escape being around this vicarious trauma. But there's no place I would rather be, because it's real. And when it's real, there's also the opportunity for real solutions and real hope and real intervention. And that's where Apni Ap comes in. And, you know, Ruchira very graciously called me a Gandhian, because Apni Ap is based on these Gandhian principles where girls and women, even if they're still very seriously trapped and traumatized, have the beginnings of an internal awakening where they can start to have some self-efficacy, some self-agency, and the idea that because freedom is an inside job. It has to start from within. And then I'll let you take it over and describe that a little bit more.
So Apne Aap is based on the two Gandhian principles of ahimsa and antodaya. Ahimsa means nonviolence, and we often think it means nonviolence to the other, but it also means nonviolence to the self. And this applies in the context that I work in the red light area, because of course, you know, the women who are violated by the men, there's non-violence inflicted on them. But the men who are buying it are also inflicting violence on themselves. There's something going on inside them which makes them so angry. They beat up the women, etc. So they need to practice non-violence internally and externally, which is why Apne Aap is based on the principle of nonviolence. And the other principle that it's based on is called Antodaya. Antodaya means uplift of the last. And at one time when Gandhi was with the British reporter asked him, Mr. Gandhi, why do you always travel in a train second class? So he said, because there's no third class. And Gandhi was always motivated by a book which he had read of John Ruskin's called Unto the Last, which is that, you know, a state, which means a government, must create systems which reach the last. And through that, Gandhi evolved a mantra which says that no change is impactful or has any meaning if it does not impact the most vulnerable person you know. And to me, that most vulnerable person, as a journalist, when I was walking through the hills of Nepal, as a woman who was in the brothels of Bombay, as someone who's here in New York, you know, working with so many NGOs and survivor groups, that person was that 13-year-old in a brothel, or the 19-year-old in India, or a 19-year-old on a street corner in Queens, because she really was, her choices were all taken away from her. And traffickers actually preyed on her lack of choices, or absence of choice, as I call it. Because, you know, many people go around saying, oh, prostitution is just a job like any other, it's a choice. But I noticed that prostitution actually was an absence of choice. It was a survival strategy at best, a death sentence at worst. And what traffickers did was they actually go around looking for the person. And I want you to just close your eyes for a few seconds, not for long, and imagine that 13-year-old in a brothel in Bombay with tiny rooms, tiny bars on the window, a 4 by 4 foot room, a bed. And as Ashley was saying, a child playing on the floor, she's sitting on the bed. There's only one exit with a man standing outside it. And what does she look like to you? She's got lipstick on her lips. She's got mascara on her eye. She's got a fake smile. But who is she? She's poor. She's female. In India, she's oppressed caste. She's just a teenager. And she should be in school with a school bag. And instead of that, she's sitting on this bed. And if you think more, where did she come from? She probably comes from a family where there was hunger, there was likely, you know, unstable housing, and also perhaps from a marginalized group where people told her and her family that this is what she has to do. So that is the last girl. I call her the last girl. And Apneap's entire work is based on uplift of that last girl. How do we increase her choices? How do we decrease choices for those who prey upon her vulnerability, which we in the anti-trafficking movement call addressing the demand? And so this is what I've been doing. And, my whole journey began very accidentally, as Ashley knows, because we've now known each other for many years. It began, where I was walking in the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages with missing girls. And I asked the men drinking tea and playing cards, where are the girls? And they said they all are in Bombay. I followed the trail, ended up making a documentary on the subject, won an Emmy for it. And when I was in New York and looking at the bright lights and applause, all I could see were the eyes of the women who had broken their silence with great courage because they wanted to save their daughters from the same fate they had. And that really was my last and first. And, for me, last girl first is really my motto.
Yes.
And you know that.
Yes. And the girls and women who are trafficked from Nepal, once they get to the brick and mortar Kamatipura, Falkland Road, brothels,
Sonagachi.
yes, in Mumbai, they're called Karza, and they're kept literally behind a curtain at least, and sometimes physically behind bars until they're broken in such a way that they then blend in with the native Indian population. And, they physically look different. They're a different ethnicity, and they're very recognizable as being Nepalese, Karza. And it's just devastating to see. And I'm so grateful that you were in Nepal and had the courage to say, hello, where are the girls and women? And the men are so bold with their entitlement to female bodies that they're like, oh, they're not here. They're in the brothels, And Ruchi made this document called Selling of Innocence, which you can watch online. And I hope you will, because there's this whole network and system of participants along the pipeline, the recruiter, the groomer, the trafficker, the transporter, the driver, the people who facilitate at the border, the people who look the other way. And I've been to that border between the crossing point between India and Nepal with all the trucks and the people who are like, oh, I'm not going to wait to buy her in the brothel. I'm just going to, have paid rape with this person right now. And so there's so many enablers. The entire ecosystem facilitates the male entitlement to these female bodies. And so there are lots of NGOs and lots of different ways that governments and individuals can break the system down. And what I love about the work that I'm able to do with Ruchi, it is being with the girls and women themselves and having that human connection, and also breaking down the isolation, because it's very odd in a way that girls and women who are stuck in brothels are often isolated from each other. And that's what Apneap does. And sometimes we have safe spaces within the red light districts where girls and women can just go where it's quiet and they're not physically harassed and the music isn't playing and there's no threat of the pimp sticking his head in and saying, it's time. And there can be a coloring book for a child, or they don't have children clinging to their bodies because the children can actually take a nap without being disrupted and be in a puppy pile over in the corner. And then the women, not only having some internal peace, can actually start to get to know each other outside of these objects of commodification there for male pleasure. And these safe spaces are very holy places. They're very holy places.
Ashley has described the texture and the work that we do both together so beautifully that, I wish I had asked her to add a few paragraphs in my book, because that's exactly what I've written about in my book. The street of brothels with mud huts, the noise of the music playing all the time, the kids piled up like puppies at one corner, while people are exploiting their mothers, and everything that you described is in the book. And yet, what I really found, and when I began working, I would go around to all the foundations begging for money, right? Like, I want to educate one more girl, I want to set up another soup kitchen, I want one more community center. and everything costs money. And then you have to hire staff, and then the staff needs money and salaries. And, it just went on and on. And the foundations were mostly, headed by men who had never been anything near anything like this. So they only saw the glamour and they saw the smiling faces of the women. So they used to tell me, "Oh, prostitution will be as old as the hills. You can't change that." Or men will be men. If prostitutes don't exist, then girls from good families will be raped. And so, there was an inevitability about it, but also a sexism and sort of also elitism about it, that some girls have to exist so that
Right.
other girls can be safe. Like, it was just a lot of it in those answers. And I even, all the foundations were making plans top down. Like, what can we do to help anyone or anything? And basically, they would have a view which was very product driven. Like, what is the product we can get there to solve the problem? And let's move on. Whatever is happening to the girls, never mind. So, one of the products they focused on was the condom. And they would come into the red light areas that I was working in and hire pimps and brothel keepers to distribute condoms. And meantime, so I saw, and what happened was that they began to entrench the industry. The pimps and the brothel keepers, they made them stronger at the cost of the women and girls. And as Gloria Steinem put it very beautifully, she said they began to protect male buyers from disease rather than protecting the women and girls from the male buyers.
Yeah.
And so I would go and say, why don't you invest as much money as you're investing in condoms in the education of a girl? And literally, the best known foundations would tell me that's not possible. How do we know they'll finish school and college? So, my book actually is a gift to all those foundation heads to tell them the story about, yes, that girl has succeeded. You used to ask me, how do we know that this girl can finish school and college? That girl has finished school and college, and she's now working in a call center. Another one is working as a doctor, a police officer, a lawyer. And we stuck by them, addressing their most basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, of course, through women's collective action, and got them back into school. So, they can keep looking at the Excel sheets and, follow some paradigm called SMART, which is smart, specific, measurable, achievable, results oriented. And, based on a product, you can count it, it's measurable. You can distribute it within a month or a year or a day. So it's very time bound, but it didn't do the results that our work did, which was holistic, began from the bottom and transformed the entire red light area. When I began, the red light area in Forbesganj in Bihar that I describe about in my book, I Kick and I Fly, there were 72 brothels. And as we kept working and getting kids into school and the women connected to just very basic things, you think these are, anyone would have them, but connecting them to safe and independent housing or food
Ration
coupons,
cards,
ration cards.
identity papers.
Yes, identity papers. It becomes such a difference between someone knowing you as a person or not knowing you. And we called it the 10 asset approach because some of the assets were tangible and some were intangible, like friendship circles. Like, we used to form these 10 circles, and Ashley would come and sit in those friendship circles. So we cut across cultures and continents and race and skin color and I don't know, so many things to destigmatize, because even Ashley coming there was more important than a foundation head telling me men will be men, right? And sitting in a circle, that was our challenge to all of this inevitability. And this book literally shows how girls succeed.
Yes, yes. And, when Ruchi's talking about working with foundations, so I freely admit that I was unfortunately a part of this condom distribution for a while until I knew better, because I was working with PSI, as I mentioned, and they were recipients of Gates Foundation money. And we thought we were trying to help prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS and allowing prostituted women to negotiate a price for paid rape, serial body invasion, which is what prostitution and sex trafficking actually is, so that they would not contract HIV/AIDS, but it was just as Ruchira, it's through the looking glass. It was empowering male demand for female bodies instead of diverting this money toward addressing gender inequality, which is the total basis for the sexual exploitation of girls and women in the first place, which I learned very saliently in Madagascar when I was sitting in a brothel with a bunch of women. And I am always very interested in the story of how a woman ended up there. And this one woman, she just waved her hand with this fatigue. I mean, the fatigue of hundreds of millions of women. And she literally just said, same old, same old. I mean, it was the story of oppressed women and gender inequality. She didn't have access to seeds. She didn't have access to marketplaces. She didn't have access to safe drinking water. Her children had diarrheal disease. She didn't have land tenure. Maybe her grandmother was a widow. And so all of her belongings were taken away from her, just no legal rights, no civic access, not the inability to cast a vote. Everything that happens with the legal, cultural, social, political disenfranchisement of girls and women sets up this class of women who become prostituted and trafficked. And I loved what you were talking about in terms of, who we can prostitute and who we can't, because in our Western culture, we just call that the Madonna and the whore, right? It's that classic split of, I'm going to catcall her, but then I'm going to walk her home. Like the girl and woman I want to protect from male harassment, which Diane Rosenfeld calls the fallacy of the male protection racket, PH, the fallacy of the male protection racket, because this girl or woman I'm going to, leer at or look at in pornography, which is public health crisis. 2/3 of all downloads on Google are pornography. But then there are other girls and women who I want to make sure I coddle and protect from either my own bad behavior or the bad behavior of other men who I'm not willing to disrupt in their bad behavior. So you see this loop, and it all boils down to gender inequality, which is why we should all be feminists.
Yes. And to add that neither of us are against condom distribution,
Not against condom distribution.
but we want it integrated with all the basic needs of the most vulnerable people, because that is integral to a person starting and saving themselves, right? And that is what we tend to forget because we want to take the easy way out. We'll say we are reaching the bottom third, but we actually want to skim the top of the bottom. And you have to go very deep to bring about that change. And a lot of the work that Ashley has been doing has been across the world, as she's been a global ambassador and is a global ambassador for the UN. And what we notice is that the problem of human trafficking is global. The United Nations says it's the second largest organized crime in the world. The average age of a girl being sold into the sex trade in India is between 9 and 13. In the United States, it's between 13 and 15, not very different. And in most places, exactly what Ashley was saying is that the person who's trafficked is the most vulnerable, the whore or the Madonna. Who becomes, quote unquote, the whore? The person who is easy for the traffickers to prey on. So they look, in America, it's racialized, it could be a Black girl, it could be Native American. So therefore, what are we doing to reach that most marginal person, even in the United States? And just to bring the conversation to the book for a second, because I just want to share with you, since you all are here, is that I wrote this book for young readers. I chose Scholastic as my publisher because I know Scholastic gets into every school and every library, and they do it in such a positive way. And my book is also trying to tell a very hard story in a very positive way. This girl is a kung fu fighter. So she's fighting her way out of poverty, and then she's building alliances along the way. It begins in India and ends in Queens, because I wanted to show how universal this issue is. And there's a moment in the book where she's in a shelter talking to other young people, and they all are giving their backstories of absence of choices and what happens and why they or their mothers ended up in the sex trade. So how do we take it on are the issues that Ashley and I have been talking about today in this fireside chat, that you can invest in so much more than just protecting the male buyer from disease. You can invest in her housing, you can invest in her education, you can invest in her self-confidence, her self-defense, the change within and without that Ashley spoke about so beautifully, and protect her from the male predators by holding them accountable. And I know that Proskauer and Rose does some work with different NGOs in New York City on that, like how do we create better laws to protect the women and girls, decriminalize the women and girls, as we call it, and punish the traffickers and the buyers so that we can shift the blame from the victim to the perpetrator. Because a poor girl has no protection if she's hungry and there's a guy on the lurk. So, which is why it's important to be able to do that. And so, it's a journey, and the one success that we both have to report, I think, is that when we began working on issues of sexual abuse, there was a silence. And people would say, oh, it's your fault, you don't say it. Ashley gave her own personal story about when she spoke up and she was told, no, no, don't talk about it, right? So what does that do? It just adds to the trauma that I'm being gaslighted. You don't have the vocabulary at that time, right? And I, as a storyteller, broke the silence first by the documentary I made. And now I'm trying to break the silence again for young people, because this is happening to people their age, but nobody wants to talk to them about it. It's happening to them. In schools, we know, in our backyards, it may not be as extreme as what's happening in this book, but they are being body shamed, they are being bullied, they are being sexually abused. There's a report right now out from the Center for Disease Control, which says that teen mental health and unhappiness and loneliness among teenagers is so widespread, is the biggest pandemic in America. 1 in 5 girls, schoolgirls, have reported to being raped in the last year alone. And and what are the root causes of that? Exactly the same as what's in my book: body shaming, bullying, sexual abuse, all the things that we are talking about. So with this book, I'm trying to break the silence. It's a call to action. It's a message in a bottle, that let's talk to children truthfully. Let's not hide things from them, but let's do it with hope.
Yeah. It's abusive to point out a problem without also highlighting a solution, which is why Kick I Fly is so generative of hope, and why, whether it's looking at the Apnea website, which is obviously based in India, or looking at Rachel Foster's organization, World Without Exploitation, which has a youth cohort, and the youth cohort leader is here today. You're very welcome to visit with her. You raise your hand, or looking at the Demand Abolition website, which really focuses on the data-driven research that talks to men who do buy exploited sex, and all sex that's bought is exploited. That's not necessarily being redundant. And understanding that, the conversations that we have in this country right now about so-called sex work is very distorted and very twisted, because it's neither sex nor is it work. And that's not necessarily the express topic of this particular convening, but when that comes up, just flag that and be aware that that is a distortion, and it's a very popular position. And, my great friend, Nicholas Kristof, who's an ally to Ruchira and me, and in fact, Nick was a great champion of Ruchira's, he recently published a piece about the best mother in the world, who was a mother herself, who was trafficked as a child in the brothels, and has turned her life around in very extraordinary measure. And he used sex worker and prostituted and trafficked woman interchangeably in his piece. And I'm like, Nick, and we had just had lunch the day, literally, he was approving the pictures for the piece. We were having lunch. And, this is one of the more enlightened and progressive white guys in the country. And so we have a long ways to go with our vocabulary, but you don't have to make that mistake once you leave this room, because when we know better, we do better. So it is now incumbent upon you to catch people and yourself and say, she's a prostituted woman, she's not a sex worker, because capitalism does not reach to the skin, and serial body invasion, is not meant to be work.
True. Very, very true. And what I would love for you to do, Ashley, is if you could read a little bit from the book.
I would love to.
Here.
I would love
I
to.
think this is the chapter you're going to like.
Okay. I Kick, I Fly by Ruchira Gupta, Chapter 5. After days of mourning, May returns to break stones on the highway. She says we can't afford another day of no wages. We have loans to pay and food to buy. I'm ordered to stay in the hut with Sinea, who is gurgling and happy, and yet I can't help but feel entirely alone. I have one eye trained to look out toward my uncle's back room, one ear attuned to the noises. Finally, Mira Dai comes by between clients. For once, she isn't drunk. She helps me make cow dung cakes to fuel our stove for the night. You've really lived when you've made cow dung fuel. We pat them dry in the sun, and the words begin to flow out of me. I tell her everything that has happened about Manish and the school principal, about Rini Dai and Kung Fu. It seems like a lifetime ago. She shakes her head in anger. Plop goes the cow dung patty as she throws it on the ground ferociously. I laugh and realize how long it's been since I felt that particular urge. That's not Manish, Mira Dai, I say, still smiling. She turns to me with a conspiratorial smile. I know, Hira, but I just hate how they treat us. We are human. Our blood is the same color. We have the same 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, 2 legs and hands. She does a little jig with her arms and legs to demonstrate. Our laughter helps to transform the feeling in the air. Mira Dai ties her dupatta scarf behind her as she pulls out our little bamboo stool and comes to sit near me. Hira, now more than ever, you need to go to school, she says with a shake of her head. I chew on my bottom lip, waiting for her to suggest something. Tomorrow, after you and Mai and Baba are gone, go to the girls' hostel and meet Rini D. She sits there every afternoon. I will send her a message today. She will help get you back in school, I promise. What if something goes wrong like it always does? I ask. She gives my shoulders a shake. Do you want to end up like me? Don't you know what my father is telling yours right now? That this is the year to take you to the fair? Her arms drop to her sides, and she knows she has said too much. I feel my hands go cold. This year? So it's true? Even after what? You think your sister dying will save you? It only makes matters worse. We are both sitting on the ground now, desolation hanging heavily between us. I think of what the women said when they came to pay their respects. After the funeral. They are older than me. Perhaps they know something I don't. I look out at the lane. An old man is sitting outside Jamila Bua's cafe, watching the latest news on the TV screen that she's put up for her customers. I wonder how she can hear anything over the noise. What if everyone in Girls Bazaar, Chacha and Baba are right? Did Chotu die because of me? What if I did bring the family bad luck? I voice my doubts aloud. This grabs her attention. Since when did you begin to believe all this superstitious nonsense? I don't meet her eye, focusing instead on Jamila Bua as she fries the onion fritters for the lunchtime rush. A black crow drives a sparrow away from the garbage. It's a stark reminder that the mightiest will survive. That destiny decides who will be mighty. It's the way of the world, Mira Dai. If destiny hasn't decided where I was born, who has? It's all a birth lottery, I say bitterly, walking up and down inside the small space of our shack. Mira Dai comes and hugs me. She strokes my head. I know you feel frustrated, but do you have a choice? What else can you do? I steer the conversation away from destiny. In my heart, I know I don't believe the superstitions. All the women in our lane believe in the eternal, inescapable fate of our nomadic Nat tribe because they can't imagine anything beyond it. There was no defiant mother or cousin or sister to fight for them. I decide to spell out my fear. What if I don't understand anything? There, I've said it. I don't want to be the stupidest kid in the class anymore, especially knowing what the boys will do to me. She looks at me with no expression on her face. Then her brow furrows into a small fold. As far as I remember, you did fine in school, at least when you were a kid. You used to get the highest scores for reading both aloud in Hindi and English. You used to be so fond of books, I could not tear you away from the school library. She smiles at the memory. I smile back. I used to love the dusty library, the smell of books and the stories I read in the privacy of the desk between the shelves by the window. Lots of beautiful words I can't pronounce. And the adventure stories by English writers like Enid Blyton and Laura Lee Hope. Words have always come easily to me. Then the hunger came, the bullying, the chores at home, my first menstruation. Everything slipped away. That was because you and Salmon would help me when I got stuck, I mumble when my head came down. Then ask Salmon to help you, she suggests. He's always so busy with his studies, I mutter. Can't you help me? Do you think I remember anything after the hell I've lived through these past few years? There was an aggressive edge to her voice. I see a small, worn spark of hope fight the fear in her eyes. She wants to convince me to go to school against all the odds I face. Under her clumsy makeup is a desperate appeal. I look at her and remember her full-throated and happy laugh as a girl. I resolve to rekindle the laughter, light, and hope in her eyes. I will overcome my fears for her. I will fight for my future, for the dreams that she could never make come true for herself. Outside, the sky is gray, the sun sending out weak rays through the mist. Far off, a train whistle blows. I give Mira Dai's hand a squeeze. I promise I will go meet Rena Dai. I want to anyway. Mira Dai finally smiles again. She gets up to go. She can't stay long in case Chacha or Saukat start looking for her as soon as a new client appears. I will send word to Rena Dai that you will go to her tomorrow, she says as she ties her scarf around her head. Her body language changes. She stiffens, drawing in her shoulders as she walks away. Selfishly, perhaps, I realize I'm not doing this for her, just I want to be a person. I want to kick and fly. I want to win. I want to have the courage, like Rena Dai, to demand a life without fear. Thank you.
Yes. So questions, do we have time for a few questions?
There's always time for a few questions.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's incredibly overwhelming. I think we're all probably choking back some tears here, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about work that you're aware of that is happening to stop the normalization of this behavior by men against women. I'm also curious if you could talk a little bit about what is happening to push corporations to lean in on this from a corporate social responsibility standpoint. I could talk more about public policy. We're in the great state of New York, which is a leader in public policy, and I'd love to delve into that too. But I just think we'll start with those two questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk about Jackson or do you want me to?
You start first,
Okay.
and also we can ask Rachel as well, because Rachel is
Yes.
here too.
Yes. So in terms of stopping the normalization of male sex buying and male harassment of women and just in general, these sexist attitudes, I would suggest taking a look at a great feminist named Jackson Katz, and he has a program called Mentoring Violence Prevention. And Jackson's programs are available to be brought into your workplace, your university, your community organization. And he works with the military. He doesn't call it sensitivity training. It is leadership training, because it is leadership for boys and men. And it's incredibly sophisticated. It is data driven, and it is tremendous. It is Jackson himself who taught me to say it is male violence against women, because from whence does this violence come? And he holds men and boys accountable, and also teaches these bystander intervention behaviors and runs scenarios in real time so that boys and men act out these situations where, you know, a guy, it might be as mild as a wolf whistle, or it might be, you know, beginning to act out violence. And then in real time, they do these intervening situations so that people on their feet know how to disrupt male violence against women. And Jackson is incredible. You can watch his TED Talk, you can read his book, Why Some Men Hurt Women and How All Men Can Help. It's called The Macho Paradox. He's made a couple documentaries, so he's a great favorite of mine. There's also
Demand abolition.
Demand Abolition, which takes a look at changing the behavior of men who buy sex. And then also, if you're watching porn, just stop. And if you can't stop, go to Love and Sex Addicts Anonymous or talk to a therapist. Because, you know, as Ruchi said, the average age that men start raping girls and women in this country for paid sex is about 13 to 15. But of girls in college, 1 in 3 was choked by her last sexual partner. And this comes from pornography, and it is ubiquitous. I'm going to see my friend Jessica Chastain tonight in a play. I was very disappointed in her show, Marriage Story. You know, this enlightened, progressive, elite university professor husband of hers puts their child to bed, goes upstairs, cruises the internet, looks for pornography, picks a woman of color and watches it. Totally normalized in that HBO show. It is everywhere. And it is directly correlated with the male demand for female bodies, and has to be talked about in conjunction with prostituted women and this male behavior. And men are more likely to pay for sex when they know they can get away with it, when they're watching pornography. So I'm just bringing that in. So if you're watching it, stop. And if you can't stop, get help.
Yeah, and just one more thing, like I have a campaign on my website called Cool Men Don't Buy Sex, and it's a student-run campaign. And basically it's trying to show that there can be other models which are not based on violence, exactly what Jackson is doing in a big scale. And we're trying to get into the hearts of boys faster, so that before the pornographers can, which is really hard, because now with technology, what is happening is that, you know, a kid is surfing on the net, and AI is helping traffickers actually process large data very fast. So if they see keywords popping up like suicide or lonely or something, you know, they know these are the boys they have to reach out to fast. And then, you know, the boy will suddenly see a girl cartoon character popping up saying, want to have some fun with me? And 2 clicks later, when he's just 12, you know, he's watching a girl being raped, penetrated in every part of her body, crying and saying, give me more, yes. So he begins to think sex is connected to violence, and also that yes means no means yes. And so, you know, he then becomes this potential sex predator, sex buyer, because he doesn't know anything else. And that's why, you know, along with the book, Scholastic has prepared a reader's guide for adults, which helps us to have these conversations with boys and girls. And just 2 days ago, there was an actor who gave this book to her 12-and-a-half-year-old son. And she said he finished the book in 2 hours and then began to ask her questions about human trafficking. He said, why did that girl have to take her clothes off? Why did you have to put a phone into her blouse to make it look bigger, etc.? So what happened? She told me, she said, Ruchi, I would have never had a conversation with my son about these issues. So we need to break the silence and offer different models of masculinity, because we did have in our culture the word gentleman. Where did that come from? There has to be something out there which is good. And of course, the law is supremely important to go along with it, because there are people who actually thrive off violence done to women's bodies, and they need to be held accountable, because without that, it's not deterrent enough. And that's what, there's a model in the world right now, a legal model, which is called the Nordic model, which asks for the decriminalization of women. So women and girls should not be punished and arrested and all of that, or blamed, but it should be the traffickers and the buyers who are basically exploiting them. Sandy.
Hi, thank you. Well, it's wonderful that you've written this book. It's a hard subject. It's written it's a novel, so it kind of the story, it allows you to sort of express a lot of these very difficult conversations in a way, and the story just takes you away. I have a question just in general. Are there orchestrated interventions where, if you know that there's a large group, in India, there's the brothel or whatever, how does that manifest itself in America? I know we talk about Queens but does your organization, or are there sort of really massive interventions where you can come in, sweep them out, that kind of thing? Is that done very much in the US?
There is some, and Bill can answer to that, and Rachel can answer to that. But now there are anti-trafficking coalitions of NGOs, and they work with law firms and they work with the government to do exactly what you're talking about. And some states are more serious about this intervention and some less, and some fund these NGOs to do it. There's a national trafficking hotline, which is on my website, ruchiragupta.com, which everyone will find, any website that you go to. And there are services now more available since we began working on this issue. So that's why the success we have to report is that when I began working, and Ashley began working, or Rachel began working, and there are some people today who are not in the room because they came to the previous event, when, it was all called prostitution, and, oh, men will be men kind of thing. Today, we say the word sex trafficking. So we know there's a process and there's an outcome. We also have a UN protocol to end trafficking in persons. We have the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which is the US law. So things have changed a lot now. There's budgets, there's services, so victims can come forward, knowing that they won't be in more danger if they do. And I'd like to ask Bill to say a few things about these interventions.
I mean, traditionally, the unfortunate thing is that people who are prostituted are the ones who are being arrested, the ones who are going to court. And even if though ultimately charges are dropped, people have to realize how humiliating it is to be handcuffed, to be put in the back of a police car, to be put before a judge, and you're basically dehumanized. And it's really, I think, one of the worst examples of how the system of justice is a vehicle of injustice. Unfortunately, that still occurs. It still occurs in New York City. It still occurs, throughout the state. And to me, that is the most unbelievable part of this whole process. Not just that the perpetrators aren't being prosecuted, but that we're prosecuting victims. Point to one other area of the law where victims are prosecuted. I can't think of any other. Yeah. And so we've made progress, but now we're almost making too much progress, because now there are many people who want to abolish prostitution entirely as a crime, even for traffickers and even for those who are buying sex. And so that is a progressive cause among some, that could do a tremendous amount of damage if in fact the law just makes it not a crime, because then there'll be no place for people to go.
No protection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what Bill is saying, and this is what I was referring to. So for example, if you look at the Amnesty International website, it's extremely confusing because they support what we call full decriminalization, which means they're advocating Amnesty International for the legalization of pimping, brothel keeping, and sex buying. When you look at their website, all they talk about is so-called sex work, and they have women who are trapped in prostitution talking about why they need to be decriminalized. And the Amnesty website doesn't say anything about how there'll be a brothel next to your Lululemon and a man can go and buy anybody, and pimps, anybody could be a self-declared pimp and start a cottage industry pimping girls and women. So it's a confusing world out there. And what you need to know is that you support partial decriminalization, the decriminalization of girls and women, and the equality model. And you support the criminalization of pimping, brothel keeping, and sex and what am I missing? The other part. The other part. So that's that. And if you also want to know more, as Bill was saying, about how we criminalize the victims, Rights for Girls just did their report. It's on their website, Rights with the number 4 for girls, talking about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline for girls in this country.
Thank you. I don't. Is it on? Okay. I think what you're pointing to, Ashley, is this sort of narrative that's really a mythology, that this being in prostitution is about agency and choice, and that we believe in affirmative consent and bodily autonomy for people in the workplace, for somebody's girlfriend, but that there's a segment of our population, which is predominantly brown and Black women and girls, who are being purchased by almost entirely white men with disposable income. And somehow in that arena, there's consent. Ashley voiced a video which is really, really effective on consent, that if you really chip away at it, who are we looking at who's bought and sold in prostitution? And whether hunger, marginalization, poverty, gender and racial injustice really makes somebody consent to something that they don't have the power to consent to.
Yes.
And then the other piece is the exit services and strategies. So while decriminalizing those bought and sold in prostitution and holding buyers, pimps, and brothel keepers accountable, there's also the piece that we need to do more successfully, which is to provide exit services and strategies. And our coalition, World Without Exploitation, we have an incredible youth component. Young people understand this. I really, really do understand this if you talk to them.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ruchira. Thank you, Ashley. Your voices are just so meaningful and powerful.
And Rachel, what's the podcast that you did recently that's an hour-long conversation?
Yes, that was in Vermont, because Vermont and Burlington, there's a huge effort to decriminalize the sex trade in its entirety. I could always share that podcast.
It's a wonderful conversation. Rachel is so thoughtful and so calm and really has the opportunity to unpack with a lot of nuance and detail the whole debate between partial and full decriminalization. And I would really encourage you to listen to that podcast and share it. I know I learned a lot from it. Yes.
And I have the email of everybody mostly in this room. So Rachel, if you send me the link, I'm going to anyway be sending out a thank you email. So I'll put the link to the podcast there. So you don't have to kill yourself looking for the link. I'll find it for you and send it to you. Yeah. And we really collaborate because we are very small compared to the organized criminals out there, because they are like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And if we don't work together, we can't take them on. So all I can say is thank you for being here.
Do we have
There's
one more
lunch.
question?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no problem.
I didn't see.
First of all, thank you so much. This has been so mind-opening for me and so inspiring and activating. And I also like wonder what's in the pipeline. For example, like I could see turning this book into a movie. And also maybe, you know, do you have other books in the pipeline or collaborations? And again, I know that I feel any way that I can help you amplify it, I would love to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope from your mouth to God's ears that it becomes a movie or a TV series like The Queen's Gambit, because then I can reach more young people and can make even more of a difference and have more conversations. So for me, this is not, I Kick and I Fly is not just a book. I'm hoping to make a difference. I'm very ambitious for it. And what comes next? I've written a second book, which I've also given to Scholastic, and it's about similar issues. It's about human smugglers and who separate a mother and a daughter and how they find each other. And, you know, what comes next for all of us as a movement? You know, our work is not finished, but we will continue. And like the karate classes continue in my NGO Apne Aap, we will keep fighting.
Yes. And I think, and I put it with you to continue to educate yourselves, to tenderize your hearts, and to have these conversations amongst your friends. You know, take on the partial decriminalization cause, push back when you hear people talk about sex work, you know, write letters to the New York Times, who is so tone deaf and so callous and so obnoxious on this position, and be willing to go forth and be brave, because we are a smaller cohort, as Ruchira said. You know, they've got the Soros money, they've got the Amnesty Internationals, and we are, you know, I get protesters who show up to my events, you know, and I'm going to get a pie in the face someday, and it's fine with me. If I'd rather not a cream pie, but a chocolate cream pie. And so I really encourage you to continue to have these conversations in small and large spaces, because that's how we will make sure that full decriminalization does not become the law of the land in our country. Thank you.